So this week we're going to start a new lesson on the book of Daniel. And Daniel is a very interesting person in the Bible. A lot of people in modern times have tried to refute that Daniel ever really existed. They try and say it was actually something that the Maccabees wrote. They made up this person that lived back then to try and show some of the things that Daniel did that were fairly impressive things. And so Daniel himself, as we'll get into here in a little bit, actually was one of the people who were taken in the original captivity of Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar came in. And I'm kind of jumping ahead of that. Just to give you some reference, Daniel, we believe, was born right around 620 BC. And that's a date I want you to try and keep in your mind for a little bit, because when we read, we believe that he wrote this book around 530 BC. He was 90 years old at that point. And so he had a very long life, and he saw a lot of changes in these kingdoms. And it's interesting when you read the book of Daniel, because it's always talking about a new king. Well, this king did this. And then it says, well, then Daniel talked to this king, and it's a different king. And you're like, what happened in there? Why are there two different kings all of a sudden? And not only kings, but it talks about different kingdoms. Daniel starts off under Babylonian exile, and Cyrus was a Persian, and he was also underneath Darius, who was a Mede. And so there's all these different kingdoms, and Daniel was a major player in all of those kingdoms. And so Daniel was very favored by God and put into specific high positions throughout his lifetime. So we believe he was born around 620 BC. He was taken to captivity around the age of 20 years old is when he was taken. He was part of the first set of captives that were taken. When Nebuchadnezzar took over Jerusalem, there were 3 different times that he came in and took people away from Jerusalem because they kept rebelling against his authority. And so the first people he took were all the intelligent, smart, good-looking royalty people. Daniel was among that group. The next time he came, he took away like those that were remained, the upper crust that remained, and some of the workers. The last time he came in, he took the poor of the land out, because that's all that was left. And so you have 3 different times that he came in and he took people away from the land of Israel. And so Daniel, like I said, was part of that first captivity. And so it says in verse 1, he says, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the articles into the treasure house of his God." So, the very first thing it says is the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah. And this is where people start questioning the book of Daniel. Because in the book of Jeremiah, it says in the 4th year, Nebuchadnezzar came in. And so we have to start kind of study that and understand why there's 2 different dates. Well, not 2 different dates, but 2 different time frames given. And whenever you realize it, Jewish calendar actually has 2 new years. It has the civil new year, the political new year, which is in the month of Tishri in the Jewish calendar. And you have the religious new year, which God set, whenever they came out of the land of Egypt, which is the month of Nisan. And so you have two different New Years. The way they recognize how many years a king rules isn't from when he first takes office. It's from the new year. So he might have become king 6 months before his new year, his first year started, because they only counted whole years. And so, in the book of Jeremiah, they're going off of the political new year. In the book of Daniel, he's going off of the religious new year. And so in the religious new year, it's only been 3 years because they haven't passed the month of Nisan, of Nisan yet. But politically, they've already passed the year of Tishri, so it's the 4th year. But in religious time, it's only the 3rd year. And so that's how we start to realize the different writings of what's going on. And so it says, in the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. I found this interesting. I have a hard time because there's so much right here in these first 2 little places. I had a hard time condensing what I read in my commentary, and so I just copied the whole thing. So I want to read a paragraph to you. Actually, 2 paragraphs, just to kind of show you what's going on during this time frame. Remember, the people of Israel have been rebelling against God. They've had Jeremiah the prophet. They've already had Isaiah the prophet. Daniel lived during this time of those 2 prophets coming in. And so he's seen all this, well, during Jeremiah at least. And it says, the 605 BC expedition was the first of 3 major invasions of Palestine by Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabopolassar, the king of Babylon. The second occurred in 597 BC when Jehoiachin, the son of Jehoiakim, was compelled by the Chaldeans to surrender Jerusalem and go into captivity with all his princes and leaders, the flower of his army, and all the skilled craftsmen in his capital, including some of the priests, like young Ezekiel. The third and final captivity took place after the storming of Jerusalem in 587, when all the people of Judah that had not escaped to the hills and joined the guerrillas were taken into captivity of Babylon. So just to kind of give you an idea of what's going on. Note that it is important to keep these stages of the captivity in mind when computing the 70 years of exile announced by Jeremiah in chapter 29, verse 10. The interval between the first deportation in 605, in which Daniel himself was involved, and 536 BC, when the first returnees under Zerubbabel were once more set up the returnees under Zerubbabel once more set up an altar in Jerusalem, amounted to 70 years. Likewise, the interval between the destruction of the first temple by Nabuzaradan in 586 and the completion of the second temple by Zerubbabel in 516 was also about 70 years. So either way you look at it, from the first captivity to the first return was 70 years. And also, at the third captivity, they destroyed the temple. Took it apart piece by piece. Destroyed it completely. From that destruction of the temple, all the way to Zerubbabel finishing the temple, was also 70 years. And so we have that understanding that God's timing is perfect. He knows what he's talking about, and it all comes to pass. And it says, I love the way Daniel starts off. Daniel wrote the book of Daniel. And that's evident whenever you start looking at the prophecies in the later chapters. He says, then I, Daniel, saw this, or I, Daniel. And so he identifies himself like that. But in the first part, when it's a historical part, where he's just telling what happened. He refers to himself in third person. It's not uncommon. Other people at the time wrote like that. But that's another thing that people say, well, this was made up by the Maccabees, because why would he refer to himself in third person? That's because it was easier to make the reader understand. But the first thing that Daniel says in chapter 2 was the Lord gave Jerusalem and Jehoiakim and all the people into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar. He doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar came and took it. He doesn't say Nebuchadnezzar had the power. He says God did it. In the book of Daniel, he is very clear to say God is sovereign over everything. That's one of the main themes of the book of Daniel, is God's sovereignty. Whenever Nebuchadnezzar comes in and takes over, it isn't because of Nebuchadnezzar. It's because God decided for it to happen. And it's a very neat mindset that I think we should probably start adopting into our own lives. No matter what happens, God's either done it or allowed it for a purpose in your life. You just have to figure out what that purpose is. All things, the New Testament says, all things work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose. Everything that happens in your life, God has control over. So the Lord gave Jehoiakim into his hand. But, and the articles of the house of God. That's why, by the way, in the very last one, the last captivity, that's why the temple was destroyed. Because they could not get the bronze articles out of the house of God without breaking down the wall to get them out. That's how big the items were. Think about the sea that Solomon made. It was basically a giant bowl. They couldn't get that through the door. So what they do? They tore down the wall. The 2 pillars that were inside, they were bronze pillars that were something like 20 feet tall and like that big around. They weren't getting that through the door. So they just broke the door. They just broke down the wall. But Nebuchadnezzar has not met God at this point. Even though later on he meets God, he has not met God at this point. And so Nebuchadnezzar takes all these articles from the house of God. The gold. I mean, if you read the construction of the temple, the temple, yes, but also just the tabernacle in the wilderness, the amount of gold that went into it, it's insane. In today's standard, the tabernacle in the wilderness would have cost something like $4 billion to make. I mean, it's just insane how much gold they had. But he takes that gold and brings him to the land of Shinar, which is known as a place of sin. Takes him to Babylon and puts him in the house, the treasure house of his God. He is honoring his God because he thinks that's the one that did it. But later on, he'll find out different. So, verse 3, he says, Then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, but good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and the literature of the Chaldeans. And the king appointed them for them a daily provision of the king's delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. Now among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. To them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. To Daniel he gave the name Belshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. So the king decided that he's not the first one to come up with this idea. But the king decided, you know what I'm going to do to make everything run a little bit smoother, being that I have this new nation that I'm integrating into my own nation, I'm going to get some of their nobles, some of their wise people, smart kids, and we're going to grab them, And we're going to teach them all of our wisdom and our literature and our understanding of things. And what we're going to do is we're going to put them in positions to help me out. So that whenever I have to do something, and I say I need to make this law, they can state whether or not their people are going to have a problem with this law or not. It's actually a very smart thing to do for a king that's taking over a new nation. He doesn't want to kill everyone off. He wants them to be happy in his kingdom. So he brings in counselors from that kingdom. And so, like I said, this was the first time he comes in. He gets the nobles, the king's sons, he gets the wise men. These are the people he wants. He wants them good looking. He doesn't want people that look bad, because the king doesn't want to look at that all day. Just the way it is. So it paid to be a good looking guy. He didn't want people that took a long time to understand things. Whenever the chief of the eunuchs came in and said, you guys need to get over here, if someone went over there and said, why do we need to get over there? He says, you don't need to. You're not quick to understand what's about to happen. You're about to die. Those that came over, they're going to live. Quick to understand. You got to be on your feet with this, okay? I mean, it's just, they're quick to understand. They had some knowledge. He probably talked to them. They didn't sound like idiots. There's a lot of people in the world today that wouldn't pass that test. And they were good people. Among them were Daniel and his 3 friends. Okay? Young people. King didn't want old people. He wanted the young people that he could teach. And he decided he was going to appoint them the food they ate. I'm going to give them the best food, the food that the king himself eats. I'm going to give them the best wine to drink. And I'm going to appoint them 3 years of schooling. They have 3 years to learn all of the rules and regulations and the literature and the wisdom that Babylon had. Now, when I say that, we go, yeah, okay. But understand that the written law of Hammurabi, our oldest record of written rules and regulations for a country, was Babylonian. They had to learn not just the Babylonian language. They had to learn 3 languages. They had 3 years. They had to learn Chaldean, Akkadian, and ancient Sumerian, because those were the languages that Babylon was founded on. And those were the languages that the literature for Babylon was written in. So for them to learn the literature, they had to learn the language. This was not an easy course. This was a crash course for 3 years of learning all the laws, all the literature, understanding, and the religious practices. They had to learn it all, because that's what they had to advise the king about. So it wasn't like, oh, you got 3 years, you can relax. No, it was hard studying for 3 years. That's why they needed to be quick to understand. Things needed to happen quickly. And he's given them these things, and among them were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Daniel means my judge is El. Dan, El. Dan, El. Dan is judge, El is God. So, my judge is God. Hananiah means Yahweh has shown grace. Mishael means who is what God is. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. These are all young men who were born right before the captivity. And to have these particular names during that time frame is kind of crazy, because no one was following God. That's why they went into captivity. But evidently these men were from families that still followed God, that had their faith in the true God. And of course, they gave them names of Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They changed all of it, basically anything that referred to the real God, they replaced with the false God. Every one of them. But it didn't matter, because they knew who they were in God. These 3 men were among them that were pulled. These were not the only 4 Hebrews that were pulled. There was a group of them. We don't know how many. Probably hundreds were pulled out. But the only ones worth mentioning were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Those were the 4. So Daniel said to the steward, in verse 11, Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please, oh, wait a minute.
You jumped.
I jumped. Sorry.
Yeah,
Verse 8. It says, but Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. Now, why would Daniel consider these meats and this food defilement? Because more than likely, they were offered to the false gods as an offering. They were sacrificed to a false god. I mean, think about it. These were the king's delicacies. For a normal person to get part of the sacrifice, even in the Hebrew tradition, who got the sacrifices? Just the elite, the high priest, got most of it. So these are coveted things. So the king got the sacrifices. Not only did he get the sacrifices, he got the best cut of the sacrifices. When they sacrificed the bull, he got the good cut of meat. He's the one with the filet mignon. He doesn't have to settle for a sirloin. He has the filet. And that's what he's appointing. And the wine, the same thing. People would bring it and they offered it to the false god. So Daniel was like, I don't want to eat any of that. I don't want to drink it. So he purposed in his heart and he went to the chief of the eunuchs. And God had given, once again, God's sovereignty. God had given Daniel favor with the chief of the eunuchs, with Ashpenaz, and also the steward that was put in charge of Daniel. 2 different people. They both regarded Daniel very highly. And so he comes up to him and he says, I don't want to eat this stuff. And so the chief of the eunuchs, Ashpenaz, comes up to him and says, Daniel, why don't you want to eat your food? He says, because I don't want to defile myself. This stuff, according to my laws, I can't eat this. You've offered it to your God. I don't follow your God. I follow my God. And so he says, I'm afraid of the king. You have to eat this. If you don't eat this, you're going to look all gaunt and skinny. And then the king's going to kill me over it because I didn't take care of you properly. So that's what he's thinking. And then in verse 11, as I started reading earlier, so Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. As you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with him in this manner and tested them 10 days. Now, I have read this for years, and I never thought anything about it. But the commentator that I read, he says, do you realize that Daniel was expecting a miracle? What do we do nowadays whenever we want to lose weight? We start eating vegetables and drinking water. Daniel said, let me eat vegetables and drinking water, and I will be fatter in the flesh than all of those people that are eating all the sweets and the good meat. And I never put that together. He said that Daniel was looking for a miracle because this goes against all nutritional laws of nature. When you want to lose weight, you eat salads. Daniel was saying, give me a salad, and I'm going to look fatter and better than all those other people you've got going on. And so he said, okay, 10 days, the king won't look at you in 10 days. He's put me in charge of you for 3 years. Let's try this out. Let's see what happens. So in verse 15, he says, and at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in the flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine which they were to drink and gave them vegetables. Daniel just became a vegetarian. The steward looked at him and said, I don't know what's going on, because everyone else in the kingdom, when they start eating vegetables and drinking water, they get skinny and they don't look as good because they're not getting that protein. But somehow, you guys look better. So you know what? We'll go ahead and take those portions away from you. I imagine that he went, I just got myself some new food. I get to eat what the king eats now. Right? So he's good with it. And the miracle took place. I mean, I have never noticed that in itself was a miracle. And so in verse 17, it says, as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had an understanding in all visions and dreams. So these 4 young men, they're only about 20. Some people think they were actually teenagers still. So they could have been anywhere from around 15 to 25 in that area. We don't really know. But around 20. And they came out, and God gave them, once again, God's sovereignty, God gave them the wisdom in literature and wisdom and knowledge and skill. They understood it and they could work it. They can tie it together and make connections. It wasn't just rote learning where it's like, okay, what did it say on this paragraph? Okay, this is that. They were given the ability to relate them to each other and to work through it and understand arguments and be able to reason with people. It's a whole different level of learning. And so they had that wisdom from God, and Daniel had all understanding in visions and dreams. And I find that interesting because that was one of the classes they had to take. Because Babylonian wise men taught how to interpret dreams and visions. And so this wasn't something that was just like, oh, that's a good idea. Just came out of left field. Someone had a dream, it might mean something. No, they were studying this kind of stuff. That was the Babylonian culture of the time. And so they put them into lessons on how to interpret dreams. Like I said, they had their religious practices. They were probably taught how to do their magical incantations too. It doesn't say they ever participated in them, but they were probably taught how to do it, so they would understand the process. And one thing that makes me really think this is so interesting is what happened when Israel was about to go down to Egypt the first time. Joseph was sold as a slave. What did God give him? The understanding of how to interpret dreams and visions. So right before they went into Egyptian captivity, God placed a person that had understanding of dreams and visions in Egypt. Right before they went into captivity in Babylon, what did God do? He gave them a person that understood dreams and visions. There is such a tie there between Joseph and Daniel. And it's interesting. I haven't really done the research, but I heard someone say one time, Daniel and Joseph are there's only a few people, but Daniel and Joseph are two of the only people in the Bible where there is no recorded sin accounted to them. There's ties, and there's understanding, and it's a parallel. God's done it in the past, he can do it in the present. And he shows that throughout the Bible. He has the ability in all visions and dreams. And of course, that became key because that's how God brought Joseph to the attention of Pharaoh. And that's also how God will bring Daniel to the attention of the king into a greater capacity. And in verse 18 it says, "Now at the end of days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar." He's proud of these guys. These are the 4 star students. They were the teacher's pet. Everyone else hated them. That's probably how it worked. So he brings them in, and in verse 19 it says, "Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they served the king himself." No one was like them. They were the only ones that were raised in a household that believed in Yahweh and followed him still in Jerusalem. The only ones worth mentioning in the book of Daniel. I mean, we had the others like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and those few, but they weren't the young men brought in at this time. The young men that were brought in at this time, evidently none of them but these 4 actually believed in God. And God blessed them and gave them high servant positions. They were servants, but they were servants to the king himself, not any of his officials. And in verse 20, I find this amazing. It says, "And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm." He's not testing them against the young men that were brought in with him at this point. He's testing them against his teachers and against the people who have been serving him for the last 50 years. He's testing them against every wise person in his entire realm. And he's taken over several countries at this point and done this same process with their wise men. And Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were smarter than all of them. 10 times smarter than all of them. Jesus said at one point, he says, a teacher or a student cannot progress past his teacher. The best he can hope for is to be like his teacher. But Daniel and these 3 others, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they surpassed their teachers. Why? Because their true teacher was God himself. God gave them the wisdom. God gave them the favor, gave them the understanding. And so they were 10 times better than anyone else in the entire kingdom. They understood. They reasoned things out better. They pulled out passages of the Chaldean literature when Nebuchadnezzar asked about it that his own people couldn't quote. I mean, this is the type of understanding they had. And they give one last statement in chapter 1. It says, "Thus Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus." Now, once again, I could not compress what I wanted to convey. So I copied another paragraph. It says, "This verse gives us a significant fact about the length of Daniel's career in public service. He continued until the first year of King Cyrus. Since Babylon fell before the Persian onslaught in 539 BC, the first year of Cyrus might be computed as 539 to 538. But since we are informed by chapter 5, verse 31, that the rule of Babylonia was first entrusted to Darius the Mede as King Cyrus, by King Cyrus, and since Daniel 9 is dated the first year of that Darius, Darius, it is fair to assume that Darius remained as the titular king till 538 or 537. So the first year of Cyrus as king of Babylon, doubtless a formal coronation ceremony took place in 537 because of the way the years worked. We would have been 537 to 536 BC, which was probably the year when the 42,000 Jews returned to Palestine under Zerubbabel and Joshua. If Daniel was put into the Royal Academy for 3 years, his first government appointment might be around 601 BC. Thus, his whole term of service, with apparently a temporary retirement during the reign of King Belshazzar, would have been 65 years. He served kings for 65 years of his life. Then he retired, and like 20 years later, he wrote the book of Daniel. That's how much favor Daniel received. He started under Nebuchadnezzar. He worked under Darius. He worked under Cyrus, 3 different kingdoms, 3 different kings. You want to talk about God's favor. You want to talk about the fact that Daniel was taken as a slave at the age of 20. Daniel was nowhere near being the top of everything. He was a common slave. But God gave him favor. God gave him wisdom and understanding. God gave him favor. God brought him to the eyes of the king, and God kept him in service through 2 overthrows of government. Whenever another king comes in, he usually doesn't keep the other king's counselors. He kills them because they're the ones that told the other king to fight. God kept Daniel in the place he wanted him. So many times we see situations in our life, we see problems come up, and we say, oh, I'm never going to make it through this. I can't believe this happened. Poor me. Oh, it's horrible, right? And we just feel like everything is falling apart. And it may look like it. But God still gives favor. You say, I don't know what I'm going to do. Ask God for wisdom and knowledge, because God gives wisdom and knowledge. He gives understanding. And then, if you need favor where you're working, if you need favor in the situations you're in, ask God for favor. He might tell you need to get some things straightened out in your life, but He will also give you that favor. God's favor comes with obedience to God. As you become closer and closer to God and start doing what He wants, you may still seem like you're a slave in Babylon, but your position will rise. And even though you still have the title of slave, you might be in charge of a whole lot more than what you ever could have if you weren't. It's because Daniel understood whose servant he really was. He wasn't Nebuchadnezzar's servant. He wasn't Ashpenaz's student. He was God's servant, God's student. And God put him into that place that fulfilled God's plan. He became a counselor to kings and a ruler over the nation, just like Joseph. When you're in those situations, depend on God. Don't turn away from it, because that's where your stability is. It's always in God. Dear Lord Jesus, thank you for today. Thank you for all the goodness and the blessings and the favor you do give us. Father, I pray that you would help us to become more like you. Father, and follow the example of Daniel, how he trusted in you. He made up his mind in his heart that he would not do anything that would offend you, that might cause you to take away the favor because he's living a life that doesn't follow your rules. He made it up in his mind even though it could have cost him his life. Lord, and because he made that stand, you gave him even greater favor, and you gave him even more blessing. You gave him the knowledge and the wisdom that he needed to be brought into the eye of the king and be able to influence the government to become more of a godly kingdom. Lord Jesus, I pray that you would help us to follow that same example. Help us to follow the example of doing what you want us to, no matter what the consequences, because our stability isn't in our place of work. Our stability isn't in the money that we have or the position that we have at work. But Lord God, our stability is in you. You are our supplier. You are the one that takes care of us, and you're the one that will carry us through to the future. Lord, I thank you for everything you've done for us. I pray that you would take us from here. Help us to be a good witness for you everywhere we go and in everything we say and do. Lord, bring us back safely next week in Jesus' precious name.